Okay guys, this is going to be a group reaction today because we're reacting to Eastenders Cindy Beale Return 2023, how and why. I've heard a lot about this, but I'm going
Cindy went into labour this morning.
Is there something wrong with the baby?
No, the baby's fine. But there were complications. I don't know how to tell you this.
What?
Cindy's dead.
Well, apparently not. In case you missed it, Cindy Beale is set to return to Eastenders, despite supposedly dying 25 years ago. But that's not all. Ian, who is famously once married to Cindy, is also finally returning to Albert Square, following a 2-year absence from the show, after, quite ironically, his then wife Sharon tried to kill him, just like Cindy did when she was last in Wolford. Now, sadly, this news was rather unscrupulously leaked by the Sun newspaper, and if it wasn't for that, was apparently intended to be an unannounced surprise, which would have really been quite something. I mean, can you just imagine the online reaction to Cindy and Ian popping up on screen together without any prior warning? But thanks to the Sun's usual rule breaking, that wasn't meant to be. And since this news has already now spread like wildfire, I've decided to go ahead and make this video to share my thoughts about these two returns. Now, I've got to be honest, when I first heard this news, my overwhelming reaction was one of total confusion. Why would Chris Crenshaw, the show's current boss, who I think has taken EastEnders to heights it hasn't seen for at least a decade, want to bring back Cindy Beale, of all characters, from the dead? I asked that question for a variety of reasons. Firstly, and in my opinion most importantly, there just aren't many characters left anymore to be impacted by Cindy's return. Which I know probably isn't a surprise, given she was last seen on the show over a quarter of a century ago. I mean, her ex-lovers are all long gone, 2 of her children, Lucy and Stephen, were both very short-sightedly killed off, and the other 2, Peter and Cindy Jr., are no longer on screen. Her grandchildren, Louis, Peter's son, Beth, Cindy Jr.'s daughter, and Abby Jr., Stephen's daughter, also aren't around. And even Jane, somehow unbelievably, is still away from Wolford too, and there's no doubt that she would have had a lot to say about Cindy faking her death, given she raised 2 of her children, was almost shot dead by the other, leading to her being unable to have her own children, and most notably, of course, covered up Lucy's murder.
Oh, no, Lucy, darling.
Whatever she says, she started it. She made everyone unhappy.
In fact, I think Jane's absence from this storyline will be felt really quite heavily, as I think it is generally across the entire show. It's never been explained why Jane hasn't returned to Wolford, despite Max dropping his vendetta against her, which feels, to me, like a very big plot hole, given that her adopted son Bobby returned to the square in 2019 after serving time for a murder that she covered up. For that reason alone, I really thought, and was hoping to be honest, that whenever Ian did eventually return to the show, he'd have Jane by his side, which I thought his cameo at Dot's funeral was certainly hinting at.
Right, Dot. I miss you. Love. Yeah, I'm coming home.
Anyway, with all of those characters unfortunately not around to witness Cindy's return, that really leaves only Kathy, Bobby and Phil at a push as the immediate characters who are going to be affected by it, besides Ian himself, of course. Now, Cindy coming face to face with Ian's mum after making him and their children think she had died could have been very interesting and fiery, but that's only if Kathy hadn't also done exactly the same thing. Which is actually one of the biggest reasons I think the decision to reverse Cindy's death is so bizarre, because it's asking us to believe that Ian's wife and his mum both faked their deaths, which I think is stretching reality just a little bit too far and is ultimately just unnecessary. We've already seen Ian and the entire Beale family deal with a loved one coming back from the dead. Do we really need to see it again? And As for Phil, well, again, he knew about Kathy faking her death, so I'm not sure there's anything particularly interesting here to explore. I suppose he did kidnap Peter and Lucy, though, when Cindy was on the run for trying to kill Ian. But, again, that happened over 2 decades ago now, so that really leaves us with only Bobby in the current cast who'll be impacted by Cindy's return. And admittedly, this could be pretty interesting. Bobby obviously killed Cindy's daughter and his sister, Lucy, so there's going to be a fascinating dynamic between these two characters to explore, with one having killed Lucy and the other having abandoned her. But is it fascinating enough to justify bringing Cindy back from the dead? I personally don't think so. For me, Cindy's return will only be able to hit the notes it needs to if the show also brings back, at the very least, her 2 surviving children, Peter and Cindy Jr. However, in order to do that, Peter will either need to be recast again, or at least reverse back to Thomas Law, given the fact that Ben Hardy is unlikely to return, and that Dale Hudson was recently axed on the show. And Cindy Jr. will also need to be recast too, since Mimi Keene, the actress who most prominently played her, is a rising star now, and is also unlikely to return. So, I ask again, is it really worth bringing Cindy back if, for it to really have any impact, we also need her children back too, who just so happen to be very difficult characters to cast? Although, on that, I will just say that if Cindy's return does end up meaning Peter is played by Thomas Law again, I'll be very happy. I think Thomas's Peter is by far the best and most real version of Peter Beale we've ever seen, despite him leaving in 2010. And I'd love to see him back in the role on a permanent basis to hopefully give Peter a fighting chance of ever becoming a character of any continuity or substance, which he's always lacked in my opinion. Now, another big reservation I have about bringing Cindy back is that I think reversing a character's death should only happen if that character is so missed that the audience is willing to suspend disbelief and go down the rabbit hole of fake deaths, police cover-ups, and the like. All plot devices that are very far from everyday East End life and shouldn't be commonplace on the show unless there's an absolute need for it. And whilst I do think it's very plausible that Cindy could have faked her death, given she died off screen and was involved in the criminal underworld, I don't think she's missed enough by the current audience to justify that all that undoing her death is going to require. The fact is, although Cindy is undeniably an iconic character, the vast majority of the show's audience today won't have been watching when she was last on the show 25 years ago. I spend a lot of time reading fan theories and thoughts about Eastenders, and I don't think I've ever really seen anyone seriously call for Cindy to come back from the dead. At least, not in any large numbers anyway. In fact, and this is another reservation I have about Cindy's return, whenever I do see a fake death storyline discussed, it's always, pretty much without exception, about bringing back Ronnie and Roxy Mitchell, who I'd personally argue are the only characters whose returns from the dead would really be worth it. Roxy's recent appearance in Amy's Imagination proved that there is huge demand from the audience to bring her and Ronnie back full-time. And if they were ever to return, unlike Cindy, it would impact virtually every corner of the cast. And I think that, for me, in addition to the audience not really calling for it, and based on the current makeup of the show's cast, is why I'm kind of disappointed that Cindy's death is being reversed, because ultimately it reduces the likelihood of Ronnie and Roxy also returning too. It would be complete overkill to have Kathy, Cindy, Ronnie and Roxy having all faked their deaths. So the fact Chris has decided to tell this story with Cindy naturally means it can't be told with the Mitchell sisters, or at least not for a very, very long time. And I do think that's a real shame, because of all Back from the Dead storylines, I think Ronnie and Roxy's would have been the one to have had the biggest impact on the show's narrative and audience, even if they did die on screen, which, for what it's worth, I do think could still be explained, but I'll leave that topic for another video. It's not just a Ronnie and Roxy return that Cindy's comeback will halt, or at least make less likely though. I think it will also make it harder for the show to bring back Mick in the near future too, whose exit was very deliberately open-ended and kept a return firmly in sight. I actually already have a video on how I'd bring Mick back to the show, which is linked above if you're interested. Now, Mick, just like Ronnie and Roxy, is a much more relevant character than Cindy is in the context of modern-day Eastenders. So, again, I think it's pretty bizarre that the show has played its Back from the Dead card on Cindy when it can really only do that once every decade or so, as illustrated by the long gaps between Den's, Kathy's and now Cindy's return. So why waste that opportunity on a character the audience doesn't particularly miss or want back, when returns from Mick, Ronnie and Roxy would be so much more welcome? Anyway, all of that criticism aside, Cindy is coming back from the dead, and although I do have my reservations about this, I am still fairly excited by it. Cindy is undeniably an iconic character, and I do think that a lot of Lost viewers will tune back in to watch the show to see how and why she...
Okay guys, thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy, make sure to leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.